Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Clifford Scott Green Lecture. I'm Gregory Mandel. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it is wonderful to see so many alumni and friends of the law school, in addition to my faculty colleagues, and especially to see so many students who have joined us this afternoon. Everyone who had the honor of knowing Judge Green would, I think, agree that his depth of caring for Temple Law School students was unsurpassed, and he would be deeply pleased to see all of you here today. I'm really excited to be here today as well, and to welcome our speaker, Professor Akhil Reed Amar, about whom I will say more in just a few minutes. But Professor Amar, welcome to Temple University, Beasley School of Law. We are delighted to have you as our guest today. It is also my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Judge Green's friends and family, and in particular his wife, Carol Williams Green, who has been and remains a treasured friend of the law school. Carol was Judge Green's strength during his lifetime, and her dedication to Temple Law School, our mission and our programs, but most of all, again, our students, has been unwavering. So Carol, thank you for all you do. Temple Law School is forever in your debt. We are also very pleased to have with us today Executive Vice President and Provost of the University, Joanne Epps, former Dean of the Law School. And I want to say a few words about the Judge Green lectureship, and as I said, introduce our speaker, but before I do that, and before I forget, which I always do when I stand up here, an obligatory, please silence your cell phones if you have not already done so. So this lectureship, the Honorable Clifford Scott Green Lectureship, is one of three endowments established by Judge Green's innumerable friends and admirers. Created in 2003, the lectureship's purpose is to perpetuate Judge Green's civil rights legacy and to honor his distinguished service to Temple University. Judge Green was also the inspiration for the Honorable Clifford Scott Green Scholarship Fund, which was established in 1999 to honor his service as a federal judge. The scholarship is provided as financial assistance to enable a student who has demonstrated a commitment to public interest work to continue to work in the public interest sector during the summer. The Clifford Scott Green Chair in Law was established in 2009 to further honor Judge Green and has been held since that time by his friend and colleague and noted constitutional law scholar, Professor and Dean Emeritus, Professor Bob Weinstein. So in the brochure that you have with you today is a brief biography of Judge Green. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read everything that you have there. If we were to try to recount every accomplishment, from graduating at the top of his law school class to achieving the highest score on the 1951 Pennsylvania bar exam, to the creation of a small firm of African-American lawyers from which would come 5 federal judges, 2 state judges, and the first chair of the EEOC. It would easily consume all our time together. But I will say this, Like our speaker today, Judge Green's deep wisdom about the law was grounded in an even deeper humanity. I have learned about a case in which Judge Green freed a blind convict because the prison system provided no services for the visually impaired. I've heard about another case in which he struck down a state law requiring a married woman to get her husband's consent for an abortion. He understood and taught us that justice affirms the dignity and the humanity of all, and that when the law fails to do so as well, it must be changed. Judge Green's judicial career has been well documented and is itself inspirational. He is still revered for his brilliance, his profound devotion to fairness, and his admirable judicial temperament. He was also deeply humble, right? So humble that he turned down an appointment to the United States Court of Appeals because he believed that society had a greater need for him and that he could be more effective where he was. He was a mentor and a teacher to countless minority and non-minority law clerks, interns, and students, many of whom have followed in the footsteps of the trail that he blazed. And I know that we have at least some of those people here today. Would anybody who was one of his law clerks or interns or students please rise and let us acknowledge you? Judge Green also had a remarkable impact on Temple Law School and on our profession. In a recent conversation with Professor Weinstein about Judge Green, I learned that the judge served in the Air Force in World War II, when the armed forces were still segregated. It was subsequent to that experience that he devoted his life to combating racial and economic inequality. From his membership on the Leah Chorus Committee, which exposed racial bias in the assessment of applications to the Pennsylvania Bar, to his involvement in creating Temple's LEAP high school mock trial competition, and his service as a founding member of the Law School Board of Visitors. Judge Green was instrumental in confronting the barriers of racial and of economic exclusion from our profession. His vision and transformative voice have had a great effect on this school and on the greater Pennsylvania legal community, and we are all the better for it. It is also my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, right? Someone who also needs no introduction for many people in this room, Akhil Reed Amar. Professor Amar teaches constitutional law at Yale University, where he is the Sterling Professor of Yale and Political Science. He graduated from Yale College undergraduate, summa cum laude. He graduated from Yale Law School and clerked for then Judge, now Justice, Stephen Breyer. Professor Amar joined the Yale faculty at the age of 26. It's about the average age of a 1L in our first year class. It's quite impressive. To say that Professor Amar is a prolific writer is a vast understatement. His scholarship includes many books, several of them award-winning, as well as dozens of law review articles. And one thing I really appreciate is that his scholarship and his books especially span the divide between writing for academic audiences and for general audiences. Unsurprisingly, they have won acclaim from bodies as diverse as the ABA, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Time magazine. A legal affairs poll placed Amar among the top 20 contemporary U.S. legal thinkers. Professor Amar's work has been cited more than 30 times by Supreme Court justices from across the political spectrum, and he has been invited to testify before Congress, again on behalf of both parties. I think this is strong evidence that he has that rare combination of extraordinary intellect and deep reverence for our system of laws. I recently read a profile of Professor Amar published during the 2016 election season. With the very last question, the journalist noted that when they had Professor Amar empty his pockets for the photographer, Professor Amar pulled out 3 copies of the Constitution. If you were watching, if I recall correctly, I think he did the same thing during an appearance on the Colbert Report. And in fact, I think you gave a copy to Stephen Colbert. So when this journalist in 2016 asked Professor Amar why he has not just 1 copy, but 3 copies of the Constitution, Professor Amar said this: "People died for these words, so we should have these words literally close to our hearts. You should have more than 1 copy because if someone asks you a question about the Constitution, I think it is wonderful and democratic if you can give them a copy and you can read it together." This character, these qualities, are something that brings me back to Judge Green. Both Professor Amar and Judge Green not only possess extraordinary intellectual capabilities, not only possess a deep reverence for the Constitution, but also share that rare ability to bring to life its essential humanity, kindling a flame in both our minds and our hearts with their passion for democracy and its blessings of liberty for all. Please join me in welcoming the 2018 Clifford Scott Green Lecturer, Professor Akhil Amar.
Right here, right? Okay, great. That may be the nicest introduction I've ever received, so thank you for that. Mr. Dean, Dean Emerita, members of the extended Green family, and of course I'm including the returning law clerks in that familial description. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you very much for inviting me back to one of my very favorite cities, a place that literally changed the history of the world. I think the city where at the age of 11 I decided that I wanted to go into law. And I'll tell you about that story if you're interested. We're going to have a conversation. The Constitution is a democratic document, and I'd like to have a democratic conversation. So I'm going to get us started, but I'm actually going to go for a much shorter period than might be customary so that we can talk together about what's on your mind. Because my friends will tell you I'm quite a vain person, but I'm not so arrogant to think that you all came just for me. You, of course, came to honor Judge Green's memory and contribution, but also I think some of you came because you're concerned about our country and our world, and you're thinking about the Constitution, and you have questions, and you want to talk about things. And so rather than just drone on at you, I'm going to invite you to ask me questions about what it is that you're talking about, because the Dean is right, I do have, this is actually my Donald Trump copy of the Constitution from his inaugural, because the Constitution isn't partisan. You don't want my checkbook. Okay, this one, actually, the DeVos family gave me. This is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. This one's lost its cover, but I think I'm missing one or two, I think, here. Well, so those are at least 3. I didn't know that I was going to get that very nice introduction, but we're going to talk about the Constitution together. Oh, yeah, here they are. I was feeling a little naked without them. There's one. Oh, there's another one there. And Temple University actually sent me a check. I haven't cashed it yet because I thought it really is bad form to do that before one has actually rendered services. I brought a little slideshow, and I'll just preview these slides with you. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about my most recent book, which is called The Constitution Today, which is really the launching pad for this conversation. The issues of our era, not just what happened 150 years ago or 225 years ago, but what's happening in our world together. This book, The Constitution Today, pulls together op-eds that I've written for places like the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, over the last 20 years about the issues of our era. And let me just tee up what some of the issues are and maybe go through a few of these images and then let you have at me. You can tell me what you want to talk about, and I'll try to do my best to frame a conversation. But let me begin, before I go through all of these little slides. When I walked up to the building, I was so moved by the monument, the celebration of the monument to Lincoln the lawyer. We meet at a law school, and people make a lot of fun of law and lawyers, but without them, we are lost. And if anyone ever makes fun of lawyers, and I poke my fair share of fun at the profession, but if anyone ever does, those of you who have decided you're going to live your lives in the law, you just say to them, Thomas More, Abe Lincoln, Mahatma Gandhi. Lawyers all, and law was actually central to their greatness. It wasn't just peripheral. My brother is the dean of another very great law school, the University of Illinois College of Law, and they like to think of themselves as Lincoln's Law School, the place that Lincoln would have wanted to go to had it been available to him. He had less than a year's formal education in his whole life. That's not higher education, that's K through everything. And he helped create this land-grant university, the University of Illinois College of Law. And Vic likes to think that that's Lincoln's Law School in the way that University of Virginia is Mr. Jefferson's school, or University of Pennsylvania is Mr. Franklin's school. Penn was founded by the great anti-slavery founder James Wilson, one of the first justices on the Supreme Court, one of only 6 people to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But until today, I didn't actually know that this place really considered itself, as does Illinois, Lincoln's Law School. And if you come to my office, and I would welcome you visiting me sometime up in New Haven, you'll see George Washington in one corner and John Marshall in another, but you'll see 2 Abe Lincolns. One, a young Abe Lincoln. This is a young Abe Lincoln out front, and then the more iconic Lincoln from the memorial. So why am I mentioning Lincoln? Because this is what you may not have been aware of, but why the last election was so fraught. Because all 3 branches of the federal government, in fact, 4 branches if you really parse it carefully. The House, the Senate, both part of the legislative branch, the presidency, and the judiciary, all 4 of them were on a knife's edge in the last presidential election. That is when Hillary Clinton's party met, I can't remember where they met. It was in some really great city somewhere. When they met here in Philadelphia in the summer of 2016, it was realistically possible for the Democrats to win the presidency. She was favored. And if she wins the presidency, that means she's winning in states like Ohio and Wisconsin. And therefore, if she's winning in states, and Pennsylvania, and she's winning in states like that, that means, because there's very little ticket splitting, that her party is carrying the very closely contested Senate seats in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin. And so if she wins the presidency, her party's likely to carry the Senate. And if they carry the Senate, that means that the Supreme Court will be, for the first time in my adult lifetime, for the first time since 1970, be controlled by 5 Democratic appointees, because that hadn't happened since 1970. So if she wins, her party wins the Senate, they carry the Supreme Court. Remember there was that vacancy with Justice Scalia's untimely passing, and it would have been Merrick Garland or someone like him as the 5th Democratic appointee. And the party had a pretty good chance of carrying the House of Representatives. They would have had to carry the country by maybe 4 or 5 points in order to carry the House, but that was very realistically possible. So the Democrats could have swept the field. In the event, as it turns out, and this was absolutely realistically possible in the summer of 2016, the Republicans could win the presidency, as they did, and therefore the Senate, because there's very little ticket splitting, so they'd be the party winning contested state Senate seats, U.S. Senate seats in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and elsewhere. And therefore, the Supreme Court actually would be continue to be in Republican hands. And if they're winning all of that, because they actually have some built-in advantages in the House of Representatives because of single-member districting, they'd probably hold the House as well. So here's why it was fraught, whether you were aware of it or not. In 2016, all 4, House, Senate, presidency, judiciary, were on a knife's edge and up for grabs. Now, why did I mention Lincoln? Because the last time that was true in America, Abraham Lincoln was alive. The last time that was true was 1864. Okay? And I'll tell you just briefly why. So that's part of why it seemed especially intense. Oh, and the 2 political parties are as polarized today as they were in the 1850s and 60s, and they weren't that way for most of my adult lifetime, most of your adult lifetime. So that also contributed to the sense in which something very special was up for grabs in the last election. So when Abraham, let's go back to 1860, since I love it that it's the young Lincoln the lawyer. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, actually, but he wins the Electoral College. But there's no way his party is actually going to win all the marbles because the Supreme Court is dominated by the ghosts of Democratic appointees past. It's basically the dominant political figure in antebellum America is Andrew Jackson. From Jefferson to Lincoln, Andrew Jackson looms large as the dominant figure. His party wins the presidency basically again and again and again, and they stock the Supreme Court with folks who are basically pro-slavery types. And Lincoln, that's what Lincoln is facing. He's going to be, even if he wins, inaugurated by Roger Taney. You see a Jackson appointee, and all these people put on the court by the likes of Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, may they rot in hell. Okay, I'm not a James Buchanan fan. I know he's a Pennsylvanian, but still. So Lincoln is not going to carry the field in 1860. It's not going to happen because the court, the ghosts of elections past. Now, by 1864, you see, if he wins, he's actually, and he and his party have a chance to carry the House and the Senate and the presidency, and therefore, and the judiciary as well. So 64 is for all the marbles. Ever since then, until basically the last election, no presidential election has really been for all the marbles. In a parliamentary system, many elections are for all the marbles because if your party wins, it wins the legislature, which is not bicameral, it wins House of Commons, and therefore wins the executive branch because the legislature picks the executive branch. So you win, in effect, all the legislative committee seats, all the cabinet positions, in effect, their version of the presidency. So in a parliamentary system, you win on election day, you win all the marbles. That's not how it works for us, given that we have a 2-year House cycle, a 4-year presidential cycle, a 6-year Senate cycle, and life tenure for the justices. So only rarely do things line up such that we have an election for all the marbles. So after Lincoln wins in 1864, and he thinks he's going to lose as late as last week of August, 1864. He actually drafts a memo that he has all his cabinet officers sign saying, when we lose, as I think we're likely to do, here's what we're going to do. And he doesn't show them what they're signing because he doesn't want to demoralize them. But then, beginning of September 1864, Atlanta falls. The famous telegram from General Sherman, Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. And he goes on to victory and immortality. And the 13th Amendment gets ratified. You see, that's the movie. He has to win in order to arm, twist, and cajole and sweet talk and get that thing through. And that's going to lead to a 14th and a 15th, and that's going to change the world. But by 1868, you see, the Republicans have a lock on the Senate of the United States. The Senate is not up for grabs. And then they keep winning the presidency. The dominant political party in America, you see, was the Democratic Party before Lincoln. And then, thanks to slavery and secession and then later segregation, the Democratic Party is basically in the wilderness for decades. All the way from Lincoln to Franklin Roosevelt, no Democrat gets a popular majority. None. After being the dominant political party in America until Franklin Roosevelt. So, and Grover Cleveland can't put together 2 consecutive terms, and Woodrow Wilson wins in a weird 3-way election. So because the presidency and the Senate are basically, the Republicans have a lock on them, the Supreme Court is not in play as a general proposition from 1868 all the way through 1932. Franklin Roosevelt, even when he wins, is not going to control the Supreme Court in his first term. As it turns out, he doesn't get a single appointment to the Supreme Court in his first term, and they're jamming him, invalidating Obamacare. Oh, I mean the New Deal. Same thing. And then by the time Roosevelt's in a position to put the court in play, the House is basically in Democratic, the Democrats have a lock on the House. They basically do, plus or minus, there's a little variation in the 1950s, but basically the House is not really realistically back in play until the Gingrich Revolution of 1994. So, from Lincoln, 1864 to Roosevelt, basically the Supreme Court's not in play. And then the Congress basically isn't in play until 1994. So, and I could go on, but that's why 2016 was so fraught. Everything was up for grabs. My party lost everything. But there's always another election, you see, and one after that. And people should remember that. But let me now just tell you a little bit about the new book and because I just couldn't resist telling you a bit about Mr. Lincoln and how he looms over our conversation. So the new book walks you, the reader. It's written, as the Dean very kindly mentioned, I try to write for ordinary citizens because we ordained the Constitution. We can amend it. Even if you think the judiciary is central, and it is, presidents pick judges, and people elect presidents and senators. So I try to write for a general audience, and I try to write about all the branches and not just the judiciary. So the book begins walking you, the reader, through the branches, telling you something about the presidency. And I tell you a story about how the presidency was actually designed to be anti-dynastic. This was designed for the 2016 election. I thought it was going to be Clinton against Bush, and so I thought that Jeb, that is, and I thought that the dynastic angle might be a particularly interesting one. And there are still all sorts of very interesting dynastic angles about Trump, both dynastic up, since he is very high-born, born to wealth and power, and dynastic down if we talk about Eric and Donald Jr. and Ivanka and Jared and the like. So chapter 1 is about the presidency and its connection to dynasty. Chapter 2 is actually about the vice presidency. Its title is Nothing But Maybe Everything, which is how John Adams described the position. I am nothing, but I may be everything. And talking about presidential succession, and I think actually our presidential succession rules are a disaster waiting to happen, if you are interested in hearing a little bit about that. Chapter 3 is about fixing a broken branch, the legislature, and why I think It's particularly dysfunctional. I have a particular discussion of Senate filibustering practices and how I think they're at the root of many of our current problems. Chapter 4 is about the judiciary and how in the end we judge the judges. You see, they are not the last word on constitutional law. Lincoln surely did not think so. In his first inaugural address, he says, there's this Dred Scott case, and it's wrongly decided. And we, the Republican Party, are going to challenge it. He calls it, as he's running for president, an astonisher in legal history. I think he may be the first person to use that word, astonisher. Today, we would say, I apologize, this is maybe just a little salty, we would say that Lincoln is calling BS on, I call BS on Roger Taney. So the first 4 chapters about the presidency and dynasty, about the vice presidency and issues of presidential succession, about the legislature and its current dysfunctionality, and about the judiciary and how in the end we judge the judges, citizens in the long run. That's why they write opinions. They have to give us reasons. And you, citizens, are actually, if you understand how to do constitutional law, which is what I'm trying to teach you in these books, how you do it, you can judge them in the long run. Then there's a little bit of the next section, so that's about the branches. The next section of the book is about culture wars in criminal procedure, about race, guns, gays, and more, campaign finance, citizens disunited, in effect. It ends with what we do have in common, which is the Constitution. And even though we have very different views as a society, the Constitution is common ground for us all, and I try to end that section by talking about what it would mean to celebrate the Constitution. That has an op-ed that I ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 225th anniversary of the Constitution, because it really did all start here. And then the last few chapters are about our last 3 presidencies and the constitutional drama that maybe historians will particularly remember associated with each of the last 3 presidencies. So Bill Clinton's partisan impeachment, George W. Bush's very unusual election, his unpopular election in 2000, and Barack Obama's signature statute, the Obamacare statute, that came this close to being invalidated by the Supreme Court. So that's what the book is all about. Lots of issues that I hope I've begun to tee up if you're interested. I've mentioned guns, I've mentioned gays, I've mentioned citizens disunited. I think race was also mentioned in that chapter. If you want to ask about affirmative action or anything else. I've mentioned how the odd way we pick our presidency with this Electoral College thing, which was highlighted in the election between Bush and Gore. Let me just show you these pictures just to give you just some prompts, and then I want you to tell me what you want us to talk about. So this is an Electoral College map, actually 2 of them, and there's a story there because they look pretty similar, but there's an interesting difference between the 2. If you can figure out what dates those 2 maps are, they're 2 Electoral College maps, and what we might learn about that. These are a couple of other Electoral College maps that are interesting. These are the elections between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. That's a recent presidential election, what it looks like by county rather than by state. If we look at sort of land mass, it's a pretty red country by land. These are 2 different pictures of arms bearing in America. The top one is what arms bearing the Second Amendment looked like at the founding. It's the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the bottom one is what arms bearing looked like after the Civil War. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. It's from the 1860s, Harper's Weekly, sort of how Lincoln's generation rethought arms bearing in America. This is the Washington family. It's a very poignant portrait. I'll tell you, if you're interested, what's kind of sad and missing in this portrait. This actually is a portrait, I believe, all about many things, slavery, geostrategy, but also dynasty, if you're interested. I think the presidency has some very interesting things to tell us about dynasty. This is from a place called Philadelphia. It's the first printing of the Constitution from the Pennsylvania packet, and from the beginning, publishers understand that that preamble is actually really something important. We, the people, are going to get to ordain and establish this. It's going to be put to a vote, which is a pretty amazing thing. And no one's forcing the publisher to publish it. There's freedom of speech and of the press even before the First Amendment. You see, it's part of the very process by which the Constitution is adopted. That's the very first photograph of the Capitol building before they redid the dome. Ooh, it's big. What's up with that? This is freedom of speech and debate in Congress. Henry Clay is holding forth. Daniel is listening. The gallery is listening. John C. Calhoun is even listening. He's recently been renamed Hopper, apparently. That's a little inside Yale joke, because there's a residential college that used to be named for John C. Calhoun that was recently renamed. This is Donald Trump. No. This is Andrew Jackson. I always get them confused. They remind me of each other. King Andrew I, born to command. He's trampling the Constitution actually underfoot, according to his critics. So we could talk about that. And Andrew Jackson is an important precursor of President Trump in certain ways. The first political cartoon in the history of the world, 1754, and I believe in union, by a very interesting fellow, a printer. He's going to do some other things in his life that you may have heard of. He's going to give us bifocals and the lightning rod and the Franklin stove, in case you found the University of Pennsylvania. And you've heard of him, and you've heard of his city. But this is the very first political cartoon in the history of the world, we think, 1754. Another political cartoon from the era that gave us, from the Constitution's ratification process. There's some interesting things there. This is from the Civil War period. Shall I trust these men? On the top, Lady Columbia asks. These are people like Robert E. Lee that want to get their voting rights back. And not this man, the bottom one, an African-American soldier who's lost his limb, his leg in the service of his country. Shall I trust these men? Shall I give these men at the top the right to vote, and not this man who was there on the battlefields of glory, asks Lady Columbia. It's very powerful. It's too small, but I hope you do see that there's a leg missing. This is a spectacular parade for women's suffrage. They're marching down Broadway, with baby strollers. Now here's the thing. Women's suffrage. Okay, before women vote, women don't vote. So who gets to vote on whether women get to vote? Men. How are men ever going to be convinced to persuade women, be persuaded to let women vote? Because women can't vote themselves the vote. So how does that ever happen? Because men have to vote, women the vote. How does change ever happen that way? How do you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps? They're parading down Broadway in New York. I love this with baby. The only problem is it's a little white on white on white on white. So there'd be another pitch. This one is not white on white on white on white. This is from my lifetime. It's the March on Washington, and some of you may remember it. And we could talk about this. And boy, 50 years ago this month, we mark a very great leader of this movement was assassinated. So and this is the March on Washington, and the world changes. And our political parties become polarized as a result of the world changing with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. So we could talk about all of that. And I love that. It's a nice counterbalance to that one, just visually. I love this one. This is Home Sweet Home. This could be any state, any century. You could imagine, maybe some of you have been to play. And you see the Constitution. Well, you can't quite see it so well, but these guys are just hanging out on the porch, and the Constitution doesn't guarantee. There's a pet dog there, and someone's playing a fiddle and wearing a hat, and the kids are sort of hanging out. And the Constitution doesn't explicitly guarantee the right to have a pet dog, or to play the fiddle, or to wear a hat, or to raise your kids. but I'll be damned if you come for my dog, you see. So there are unenumerated rights in America, and how do we find them? How do we find these unenumerated rights? Because we don't want just judges making stuff up. But this is America, and you do have a right to have a pet dog, and it doesn't say that in the Constitution. What are the rules? I love this one. It says not guilty, and the caption is, women are too sentimental for jury duty. And you see all the men, crying their eyes out, and that's an anti-suffrage, anti-woman suffrage saying. Women are too sentimental for jury duty. So again, what was up with this women's suffrage thing? How did women get the vote, and what did that mean? And that was on the ballot in the last election. This was a part about women's political participation, and so that's an issue that resonates in 2016, 2018. This is George Washington's first inaugural. It's not in Philadelphia. The capital will be moved back down temporarily to Philadelphia. This is in New York. He's swearing it on a Bible. What's up with that? And here's where we end. This is another march for women's equality, my lifetime, on the 50th anniversary of the suffrage amendment. So those are just some prompts for you if you want to, just getting you thinking about constitutional themes here. They could be from the founding, about the Electoral College. They could be from our lifetime, like the March on Washington. They could be from early 20th century, like how women got the vote. They could be from the Reconstruction era. Shall I trust these men and not this man? So what do you want to talk about? Floor is open. Please. Which pictures?
The ones,
this one? So why do we have the Electoral College? I'm going to try to get you to unlearn some stuff. Okay, so these are some Electoral College pictures, and when you understand these pictures, you'll understand just how brilliant this talk is. No, you'll understand just actually how much Mrs. McGillicuddy mistaught you in 8th grade. So, how many of you were taught we have the Electoral College because they didn't really believe in democracy? It was a republic, professor, not a democracy. Ordinary people kind of weren't smart enough to figure out who should be their leader. They want it's smart people in this Electoral College to filter the thing. It's a republic, not a democracy. How many of you taught some version of that? That's why they have the Electoral College. Okay, I was taught that too, so raise your hand side. Okay, so that's clearly wrong. Look, if they didn't trust ordinary people, why did they put the Constitution to a vote? You see, we, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution, and that's pretty stunning because in the history of the world, more people were allowed to vote on the Constitution than had ever been allowed to vote on anything before in human history. So if they don't trust ordinary people, why are they in effect putting the Constitution to, maybe not a direct vote, but as close as there could be and was, in 1787, 88 in the history of the world? And if they don't trust ordinary people, why, if the whole project is about property qualifications and elites, why are there no property qualifications to be a member of the House or a member of the Senate or President of the United States for that matter? Because there's only one state that doesn't have property qualifications for office holder, for lawmakers, and that's Pennsylvania. Every other state does. Every state has property qualifications to be governor, except Pennsylvania, which doesn't really quite have a governor, but all the other states do. So, if they don't really believe, see, they don't say we the property. They don't do we the property. The word property appears only once in the original Constitution, and that's a reference to government property in Article 4. They're letting you vote directly in the Constitution for the Congress, which you can't do under the Articles of Confederation. It's more democratic by far than what you had before, which is not what Charles Beard taught us in the most famous and influential book in the American Constitution of the last century. And in chapter 1 of a book that I wrote called America's Constitutional Biography, I say Beard basically got it wrong. This is not the story that Mike Klarman, a very great constitutional scholar at Harvard, the word sticks in my mouth. It's not the story that my friend Mike Klarman puts forth in this new book called The Framers' Coup that presents the framers as a bunch of propertied elitists meeting behind closed doors in a secret conclave and led by a revolutionary generalissimo and fixing on the citizenry, a kind of elitist, aristocratic constitution designed to restrict the democratic excesses of the American Revolution, Shays' Rebellion, the farmers are getting out of control. That's the Beard story, which all your teachers imbibed and taught you in your textbooks, whether they were aware of it or not, or you were aware of it or not. That's Mike Klarman's story in The Framers' Coup, and it's completely wrong. It just is. Read chapter 1 of America's Constitutional Biography, where I tell you in the first 5 pages that in 8 of the 13 states in this, see, they're highlighting the preamble, and that's because freedom of speech is part of the whole process. We do ordain and establish this Constitution, and in 8 of the 13 states, property qualifications, the ordinary ones, are lowered or eliminated compared to what they are for ordinary elections. In 8 of the 13. Nowhere are they raised. No one is shut down politically. You can be for the Constitution or against it, and no one suppresses you politically. No one dies politically that whole year. This is epic free speech. The Constitution is crowdsourced. It's like Wikipedia avant la lettre. You know, the elites, yeah, they compose the thing, but then they let ordinary people vote on it. The first thing ordinary people say is, dudes, you forgot the rights. Bottom up, the ordinary people insist on a Bill of Rights. You see, it's coming from the people, not from old Ben who actually, good as he was, forgot to add a Bill of Rights, you see. And what does the Bill of Rights say again and again and again? First Amendment, the right of the people to petition and assemble. The Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Ninth and Tenth Amendments, the rights retained and reserved to the people. The people, the people, the people, the people, the people, because it's coming from ordinary people. So that's not why we have an electoral college, because they didn't trust ordinary people. Again, you can vote for members of Congress, and you couldn't under the Articles of Confederation. Constitution is more democratic than what went before, judged by the standards of that day. Not by today, but by the standards of that day. You can't judge 1787 by 2018. You have to judge it by 1786 and 1686 and 1586. And in the history of the world, never had an entire continent been allowed to vote on how they and their posterity would be governed. Nothing like that had ever happened. This is the big bang that changes the world. There's very little democracy in the world before 1786. In 1786, there's the Brits and the Swiss, and that's about it. In all the world, everyone else, and there have been a few little democratic city-states that have existed in the history of the world, and they blink out. Ancient Athens, pre-imperial Rome, Venice, Florence, and Rome made a pretty good go of it for a fairly long time, but basically, but only when it's a city-state. The history of the world before 1787 is the history of kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains, thugs, all. And then we, the people of the United States, actually did, in fact, ordain and establish a constitution. We put it to a vote. The world would never be the same. This is the big bang in human history. No, they believed in democracy. They say we the people. So that's not why they had an electoral college. Now, they did have it. I may have to explain why, but that's not the reason. Republic means the same thing as democracy if you actually know Greek and Latin. Res publica is the people's thing. Demos kratia is ruled by the demos, by the people. Thomas Jefferson's party alternatingly calls themselves the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, potato, potato. If democracy is a dirty word, which is what some of you have been taught, why does the dominant political party in antebellum America call themselves the Democrats? That would be Andrew Jackson's party. Because if you're founding a political party, you're going to pick a label that people don't like. Are you going to say today, let's call ourselves the fascists, because people will really like that one. Or how about the Nazis? That's a great trademark, you know. Or the socialists. No, Bernie Sanders, you clueless twit. Americans don't like that label, okay? But Republican, Democrat means the same thing. Pretty interchangeable. In fact, I didn't bring my book with me, but James Wilson from this state says, the democratical principle is carried into every branch of the Constitution. He says this proudly at Philadelphia, in the Pennsylvania ratifying debates. This is a guy, one of 6 people to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a scholarship kid. He's basically like the unsung Hamilton, because Lin-Manuel Miranda hasn't sort of discovered him, but this scholarship kid, he's, you know, Lincoln, Hamilton, Wilson, only in America stories of low-born folks. So that's not why you have an electoral college. Okay, this is what you were taught. balance between big and small states. That's why we have the Electoral College. Raise your hands if Mrs. McGillicuddy taught some version of that. Well, this is like, Mrs. McGillicuddy is an idiot, okay? America, I'll give you 6, and we can look at these pictures now. America is not now and never has been divided between big and small states. That's not the real divisions in America. The big states are never on one side and the small states on the other since 1790. At the Philadelphia Convention they were, but since then, the big states today, California, Florida, New York, Texas, do not vote together. The small states, Rhode Island is very different from Delaware, is very different from Alaska. You know, one's urban and New England, one's Alaska, okay? So America divides today, always has, between North and South. Look at this, that's basically North and South. North and South, these are the 2 elections. The North votes for the Northerner twice, the South votes for the Southerner twice, and Pennsylvania and New York are in the middle. America divides North versus South, coasts against the center, and cities against the hinterland. Those are the 3 divisions in America, always have been. It's not big state versus small state. Second way of putting it, if they're trying to help small states at Philadelphia, they're nincompoops because America has only had 3 small state presidents in all of American history. Bill Clinton, Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce. That can't be the right answer because they weren't nincompoops. They were trying to do something, but big state versus small state is not the balance. Who's your first president? You know the answer to this. One part of your brain doesn't talk to the other part of your brain because Mrs. McGillicuddy got into one part of your brain. She says, oh, big state, small state balance. But you know that this guy, George Washington, comes from Virginia. You know Virginia is the biggest state. You know that. You know that he's followed by 2 terms of after an interlude. Then there are 2 terms of Thomas Jefferson, 2 terms of James Madison, 2 terms of James Monroe. That's 8 of your first 9 presidential elections that go to the biggest state, Virginia. You know that Massachusetts is the 2nd or 3rd biggest state, depending on you count, Pennsylvania being the other contender. Maine was part of Massachusetts at the time. So all your early presidents are big state guys and mainly Virginians. So it's not a balance between big and small state. America doesn't divide that way. That's not how your early presidents are. No small state person ever even gets a nomination. None of the early tickets are balanced big against small state. They're all balanced north against south, okay? So you were taught that, okay? So it's not a balance between the Electoral College. Yeah, these smart people. It's not called a college, okay? Yale is a college. Dartmouth is a college. Princeton's a college. The Electoral College, they never, ever really exercise independent political judgment in any important election in all of American history. They're potted plants. They're nobodies from nowhere who never did nothing, who just do as instructed. And that's basically for almost all of American history. I can prove it to you in 30 seconds. Is there anyone here, if I gave you 30 seconds, couldn't name a president of the United States? Vice President of the United States in all of American history? A senator, a governor, a member of the House of Representatives, if I gave you 30 seconds. Now, is there anyone that can name for me a famous elector in all of American history? Just one, ever. They're nobodies from nowhere who never did nothing. A famous one, no, with due respect, okay? So as I'm telling you that they're nobodies from nowhere, but it's a great honor, like being the sausage king at some Memorial Day parade or something, or the cauliflower queen or something. So that's not why you have them. They're never substituting their judgment. They're never making the call. They're pre-instructed from day one. That's always been true, basically. So it's not a balance between big and small state. And it's not because they don't trust ordinary citizens. These are the basic stories you've been told, and they actually don't account for the data. Now, in one word, why do you have the Electoral College at the founding? Because this is the new teaching, and I'm hoping at least one of you will know the answer. Bob does, but he doesn't. He's an expert. So, it's slavery, stupid. James Carville would tell you. Because in a direct election world, the South loses every time because it can't count its slaves because they don't vote. But with an electoral college, you can count slaves, albeit at a discount, 3/5. And now let's take these two elections. These are North-South elections. The North votes for the Northerner twice. That would be John Adams. The South votes for the Southerner twice. That would be Thomas Jefferson. And the elections are decided in the middle, Pennsylvania and New York, both slave states at the time. Pennsylvania's committed itself to moving away from slavery. New York will soon enough, but not quite. Or it's in the process of doing that right now, right at these moments. Who's the big winner? Virginia. Virginia is a big state with a lot of slaves. You take away Virginia's extra clout for slaves. Pennsylvania in 1800 has more free people than Virginia, more voters than Virginia, fewer electoral votes than Virginia. So James Wilson and James Madison at Philadelphia are talking about this, and James Wilson says from Pennsylvania, we should actually elect the president, one person, just have a direct election of the president. And James Madison is like doing the math. He says, in principle, you're right, Mr. Wilson, but I've just been doing the math. The South will lose every time. I'd be willing to go for it. He wouldn't probably, but he's telling everyone else, you see, from the South, but it's a non-starter. And at that moment, he proposes what will become the Electoral College. Now, you would say, well, that's behind closed doors. Not everyone knows this. And if James Madison were here today, his name would be Karl Rove. He's not this anti-party guy who writes the Federalist 10. He co-founds the longest-running political party in the free world. They alternating call themselves the Democrats, the Republicans, potato, potato. He and Thomas Jefferson found the party that will become the party of Jackson, and then later the party of Buchanan, may you rot in hell, and then later the party of Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Barack Obama. Ooh, there's some twists and turns there, aren't there? Okay, but that's actually a party. He's a political operative. Okay, and he's going to succeed Jefferson as president. They found a pro-slavery party. Now, maybe not everyone understood this because it was behind closed doors at Philadelphia. But I promise you, everyone with eyeballs in America can see those two elections. And America is not dividing big state against small state. It's dividing North against South. It's just like, as plain as the nose on my face, which is very plain, very substantial. You just can't miss it. And here's the punchline. Everyone knows that even in 1800, if you took away the extra votes, 13 extra electoral votes that the South is getting because humans are held in bondage, you take that away, it's a discount, 3/5, not 5/5 would have been worse, you see. 1 would have been worse. It should be 0. You should never get extra electoral votes for having slaves. But you take that away, and John Adams wins the second time as well. And he knows it, and all the Massachusetts people know it, and all the Northerners know it, and all the Federalists know it, and they're every bit as much sore losers as we Democrats were after 2000. And they say, let's amend. And this is the heart of Gary Wills' important book called Negro President. The meme is Thomas Jefferson is riding into the executive mansion on the backs of his slaves. The Constitution is amended after that second election. It's called the 12th Amendment. That's the Electoral College we have today, when you vote separately for president and vice president. Our Electoral College is not the Philadelphia Framers one. It's the 12th Amendment one. And they fix various aspects of the system, but they don't fix the pro-slavery bias, which Northerners and Federalists say, as long as we're fixing it, as long as we're amending the Constitution, we should actually amend it. So our Constitution, the Electoral College, was about slavery. That doesn't mean there aren't reasons today to keep it. There might be. That's a different thing, and we could talk about that if I get asked a different question. We could talk about the National Popular Vote, Interstate Compact, or other things. But it's not because it's a balance between big and small states, and it's not because they didn't believe in democracy. It's because slavery complicated the whole situation. Did you want to jump in?
Well, when I was reading the book, I had my internet out.
Oh, great.
In the 1790 census, 40% of Virginians were enslaved.
Yeah.
So just so people understand that, so 3/5 of that is 25%.
That's huge.
So they essentially got a 25%
Bonus.
electoral vote.
Yes. So you can't read it, but Pennsylvania in 1800 has 15 electoral votes, and Virginia has 21, and Pennsylvania has more free people and more voters. That's lower property qualifications. So in a direct election world, Pennsylvania would have more clout, but thanks to the Electoral College, it's Virginia. And who favors direct election? That would be the Pennsylvanian, James Wilson. And who's favoring the Electoral College at Philadelphia? That would be the Virginian, James Madison. So there you have. And that's behind closed doors, but it breaks out into the open because everyone in America sees these two. I mean, they're not blind. They know America isn't dividing big state against small state. It's dividing north against south. Okay, so that's a little bit on the Electoral College. Doesn't mean that today, you know, it's completely evil, although no state has an electoral college. If this is such a brilliant idea, why does no state pick its governor this way? Why does no country around the world do this? But just for now, I've given you just a little bit of a history lesson. If you want to know, could we change it? We could, but maybe we can pick another topic, because I want to get a few more in here.
Gerrymandering.
Yes. Big topic here in Pennsylvania. So I said some liberal things. I'll say a conservative thing or two. I told you that the Democrats would have to have won the national popular vote, because there's very little ticket splitting, by about 5 points to win the House of Representatives. Barack Obama kicked Mitt Romney's butt by 5. You know, he won by 5 points, which is very big. There have only been, since Abraham Lincoln, 2 Democrats in history who have won 2 popular majorities. Franklin Roosevelt, Barack Obama, that's it in all of history. Many Republicans have won many landslides, Democrats not so much. So he won 2 popular majorities, did Barack Obama. But even though he beat Mitt Romney by 5 points, how many House districts? There are 435 did he carry. You need 218 to basically have a majority. There's not that much ticket splitting. The answer is he won about 180 some odd. Even though he's winning by 5 points, he's only winning 180 congressional districts. Now, here's what one side will say. They say this is because the Republicans have gerrymandered and that's unfair. And in 2012, the Democrats, more people nationally voted Democrat for Congress, and yet the Republicans contained control of the House. And there are people who go around saying that's just because of Republican gerrymandering. I don't think so, as a political scientist. Gerrymandering accounts for about 20% of the Democrat Party's underperformance. And it's mainly in 5 or 6 states where it's a huge problem: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. No, Maryland's on the other side. It's gerrymandered, but in the Democrats' favor, so that starts to actually cancel out a little bit. So only 20% or so of the net Democratic disadvantage is because Republican state legislatures, because they did win all sorts of off-year elections in all sorts of places. We haven't talked about the states, were able to draw the lines. 80% of the problem is not because of the district lines. 80% of the problem is because of geographic clustering. Because Democrats are choosing to live overwhelmingly in cities, and I'll let you do the math in your head. And I'll just explain to you. So in order to, for a party to really outperform, get more seats in the legislature proportionally than it wins the statewide vote, what it's trying to do is impose lots of wasted votes on the other party. This is discussed, by the way, in Chapter 5 of America's Unwritten Constitution. What is a wasted vote? It's a vote that goes to someone who loses, because if you say the election is 55-45, well, those 45 votes might have, it's as if they didn't exist. They went to a loser. So all those are wasted, a vote that goes to a candidate who loses, as are votes above. Say you want to win 51 out of 100. Well, if you win 81 out of 100, you've wasted 30 votes. You only needed 51 and you had 81. So wasted votes are votes that go to a winner more than the margin of victory, the necessary margin of victory, and votes that go to a loser. You want the other side to have lots of wasted votes. But here's the thing. So what that means is you want to win a whole bunch of races, 55, 45, 54, 46, 53, 47, pretty close. But, one, your party is made up of a whole bunch of incumbents, and they don't want to win close. They want to win big, overwhelmingly. They don't even want an opponent, and they just want to amass a war chest. So they don't love that strategy. Two, you think you're going to win all these districts 53-47, but then people move around over the course of 10 years, and they might change their ideas on certain things, and you might have a party scandal that brings, and so instead of, this is like tacking very close to the wind in sailing or something, you could actually lose all those 149, so that's a very dangerous strategy. So in order to avoid that, you have to build in a little bit of a buffer, but now you're wasting some votes. Okay, but here's the real thing. So, so incumbents are stinky and they just want to help themselves, and parties are stinky and they want to jam the other party, and they're both stinky, but those work at cross purposes to actually minimize just how bad it can get. And I'm not sure the Supreme Court has a nice, easy, judicially manageable solution. I know that one was proposed to them in Wisconsin. I don't think that actually works for a reason that I'll begin to explain right now. Here's the real problem for my party, the Democratic Party. We are moving to cities and winning overwhelmingly in cities and therefore wasting a lot of votes. And so imagine a state, you could call it Pennsylvania, which is, in James Carville's inimitable definition, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia connected by northern Alabama. So you have two cities in the state. It's Buffalo and New York City, or Buffalo, New York City, and Albany, 3 cities, and the rest countryside. Imagine, just for the math, make it nice and easy, cities amount for 40% of the statewide population, the countryside 60%. Okay, the Democrats win overwhelmingly in the cities, 80-20, and lose the rest 60-40, comfortably but not overwhelming. Statewide, Democrats are winning 56% statewide. They're winning 80% times 40, 32%, 40%, all losers times 60, 24 plus 32. They're winning 56% of the overall. That's a landslide, but they're losing 60 out of 100 districts. And they're losing not because the Republicans have cheated so much as in order to avoid that, you're winning 80-20 in all these cities, you would have to draw districts that start at 30th Street Station and like go halfway to Gettysburg. They'd have to be to pick up enough Republicans so that it's 55-45 proportionate. They'd have to be in, you have to start in Central Park, you know, district that's 100 yards wide and 100 miles long, you know, halfway to Albany. And these are people, if you drew the districts lines that way, who don't like each other, who have chosen to live apart, who are not communities of interest, who aren't in the same local governments and all the rest. So most of the problem is created by single-member geographic districts, which in today's world underrepresent the urban party. That's a problem for the urban party in New Zealand. It's a problem for the urban party in the UK, in Britain, and in the United States. So gerrymandering is part of the problem, but not the huge part. The huge part is geographic clustering, because sane people like me live in cities, you see, and that's, I'm just, you know, candidly telling you who I am, but I'm trying to, and this is what you see. This is, you know, this map. It's basically the coasts, the coastal cities against the hinterland. America divides, to repeat, 3 ways, not big state versus small state. Even though that's what we have with the House and Senate. It's not what the Electoral College was about. America divides coasts against the interior, north against south, and cities against the rural areas. One more. Please, sir.
Given that our political system, our cards are stacked against a true democracy, do you think there's any hope to do away with the Electoral College?
Oh, yeah. In the book, The Constitution Today, I explained 2 different ways you could do it even without a constitutional amendment. One involving a thing called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and another, actually, if I could persuade, and that's states can choose to give their electoral votes to the person who wins the national popular vote rather than the statewide vote. But actually, in a piece that I recently gave dedicated to President Lincoln, to Abraham Lincoln, I explained how actually all I need to do is persuade 2 people, believe it or not, 2 people in the next presidential election, and the election in 2020 could be decided by national popular vote. Only 2 people, and neither of them is named Anthony Kennedy. They're the 2 presidential candidates who could agree between themselves to abide by national popular vote rules in ways that I actually explained. You think formally elections are decided by votes and counts and recounts, but in fact they're decided by concession speeches. When the two candidates afterwards agreed on who won, whether Roy Moore's, opponent concedes or, and if they could decide afterwards, who's won, they could actually agree beforehand that they'll abide by the national popular vote. And I then explained how you could actually enforce that deal. If they agree at a national debate, on the NewsHour, PBS NewsHour or something, or, with Megyn Kelly asking the question or whomever, and we all are witnesses to this deal, it's possible you could actually do that. And let me just end because this is Lincoln's Law School, which I didn't know this morning, and now I do. So one part of your brain isn't talking to a different part of your brain, because one part of your brain was told, gee, we don't have direct election of senators until the 17th Amendment, which is the 20th century. And none of you asked how women got the vote, which is a great story, by the way, but only so much we can do. Same era, initiative, referendum, recall, direct election of senators, primary elections, women's suffrage, all in this period. Okay, so you were told, oh, we don't have direct election of senators until the early 20th century. But you also know there's this thing called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And you know that Lincoln and Douglas are actually both running for the US Senate. So what's up with that if in 1858, these people are running for the US Senate even though there's not direct election of senators? So one part of your brain has never talked to the other part of your brain to figure out, what's going on there? And my answer is just in a nutshell. And by the way, why would senators ever vote for a constitutional amendment by a 2/3 vote, which is what an Article 5 amendment requires, to change the rules by which they were elected? Because if you're elected under one set of rules, you think those rules come from God, from Moses and Elijah, and just directly from Yahweh, because they got you elected, so those have to be the right rules. So why would 2/3 of the senators ever vote to change those rules? And the answer is, we were doing in America direct election, improvising direct election way before the 17th Amendment. Most senators are actually voting for a formalization of a system that they're already that their states have already improvised. Many of the states are doing improvised versions of direct election even before the 17th Amendment. And the improvisation begins in Illinois with Lincoln the lawyer in 1858, because here's what both parties do. Both the Democrats and the Republicans in Illinois tell the voters in advance whom they will support for U.S. Senate. And so they take the 1858 state legislative election, an off-year election, and turn it into a referendum on whom you want to be your senator. If you want Stephen Douglas to continue to represent the state of Illinois in the U.S. Senate, vote for the Democrats for state legislature, and they'll vote to send Stephen Douglas to Washington, D.C. again. If you want, Honest Abe to be the U.S. Senator, vote for the Republicans for state Senate, for state legislature. And so it's not perfect just because it's only an indirect kind of form of popular input. But these improvisations that will eventually lead to direct election of senators begin with Abe Lincoln. Now, once you do that, because you have to study history, you say, gee, we started with state legislatures picking senators, but we were able to eventually get an improvisation. Gee, we started with presidents and they could run for re-election forever, and yet somehow we were able to improvise our way, beginning with George Washington stepping down, to a two-term. And he steps down because he doesn't have a son to give the office to. So just so you see here, George Washington becomes father of his country because he's not father of his own children. This is Washington's family, and there's an emptiness in the middle. There's a rising S-U-N, but no S-O-N. George Washington has no heir. H-E-I-R. That's why everyone's kind of a little sad. That's why you can vote for George Washington. He's not going to make himself a king because he's got no one to give it to. Okay? So we start with, you can be presidents for life, but Washington steps down voluntarily, and so does Jefferson and Adams, so Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, Jackson. A two-term tradition begins. We start with state legislative election. of senators and we improvise our way to direct election traveling through Lincoln, you could improvise ways of achieving direct election of presidents, and you're more likely to be able to do that if you study history and see how other improvisations have actually occurred in the course of American history. The American Constitution is this amazing story. It begins at Philadelphia. It doesn't end here. We are all part of it, and I'm very grateful that you've been here today to continue our conversation about it. Thank you.